The heat of the North Carolina morning hit Lieutenant Maya Thompson like a wall as she stepped off the transport plane. Her boots scuffed against the tarmac, each step echoing in the vast emptiness of the early morning airfield. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the rows of military vehicles and scattered personnel. Dust swirled around her, clinging to the edges of her crisp uniform, but Maya didn't flinch. She had walked through harsher conditions than this and survived. She had been summoned to Fort Bragg with a specific purpose, though no one had bothered to explain exactly why. Rumors had reached her ears even before her arrival. Colonel Richard Halloway, a man notorious for cruelty disguised as discipline, ran this base. Officers whispered about his temper, his sharp tongue, and his tendency to humiliate anyone he considered weak. Maya didn't believe in fear as a strategy, but she respected caution. She had learned long ago that arrogance and underestimation were a dangerous mix, especially in people like Halloway. The colonel was already waiting near the edge of the tarmac, his posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating even from a distance. The kind of man who wore authority like armor and intimidation like a weapon. His eyes scanned Maya from head to toe with a cold, predatory precision. There was a brief pause before he spoke, and the weight of it was almost physical. "Lieutenant Thompson," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "I hope you're prepared for what lies ahead." Maya's jaw tightened. She met his gaze evenly, refusing to shrink under the scrutiny. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension simmering in the air. The colonel nodded, but there was no warmth in the gesture. Just a quiet assessment, the kind that made you feel small even before any words were spoken. Maya had faced challenging superiors before, but there was something particularly calculating about Halloway, a precision in his cruelty that made her instincts scream caution. Within the first hour of reporting to the base, she realized that surviving Halloway would not just require skill or discipline, it would demand strategy. Every order he barked, every casual insult was a test. He seemed to feed on intimidation, carefully measuring who would break and who could hold their ground. Many officers already moved through the halls with downcast eyes and tight shoulders, clearly trying to avoid confrontation. Maya refused to play that game. She wouldn't bow, but she also couldn't afford to act rashly. Later, during a tense morning briefing, Halloway's true nature came into focus. The room was cramped, filled with officers in pristine uniforms, their expressions a mix of nervous respect and fear. Halloway stood at the head of the table, slamming a set of reports down with a force that rattled the pens and documents in front of them. "Lieutenant Thompson," he said, his gaze sharp enough to cut metal, "do you think you're ready for this assignment?" The question was rhetorical, everyone knew it. The room had gone silent, the only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Maya lifted her chin slightly, refusing to look away. "I am, sir," she replied, her tone measured but unwavering. A flicker of surprise crossed Halloway's face before he masked it with a smirk. "We'll see," he said, and with that he dismissed her from the room with a wave of his hand. Outside, the corridor seemed almost suffocating. Officers moved quickly past her, eyes avoiding contact. Maya's mind raced. She knew she had just entered a storm, and storms could break the unprepared. But she also knew that storms could be survived, even controlled, if one remained calm and patient. She paused outside the restroom, running a hand through her hair, trying to calm the rapid pulse of adrenaline in her chest. It was then that she sensed him, Halloway's presence lurking nearby. She turned quickly, almost instinctively, to see him leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his face. "Lieutenant," he said casually, but his tone carried a subtle menace, "this base will either make you or break you. Choose wisely." Maya met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I choose neither, sir. I choose to succeed." Halloway's smirk widened just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but there was a glint in his eyes that suggested he didn't entirely believe her. And in that instant, Maya understood. This was not just about orders or strategy. This was personal. The colonel thrived on testing boundaries, and he had already decided to test hers. The rest of the morning blurred into a series of drills, inspections, and briefings. Every step, every salute, every nod was scrutinized. Maya felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her at once, the kind of weight that made your muscles tense and your mind hyper-aware of every minor movement. Even seasoned officers could feel the tension, and she could sense the whispered judgments and covert assessments behind closed doors. By noon, the unthinkable happened. During a routine equipment check, Maya noticed Holloway's gaze lingering far too long, tracking her every move with unnerving precision. It wasn't enough to intimidate her physically, but it was the psychological pressure that weighed heavier than any pack or weapon she had ever carried. And she knew, deep down, that whatever was coming next would not be mild. She barely had time to brace herself before he appeared behind her in a narrow corridor. His presence was sudden, deliberate, overwhelming. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice deceptively calm. Maya froze for a split second, reading the subtle signals in his posture. There was a flash of unpredictability, a hint that his next action could be physical. And in that instant, a chilling realization hit her. She was about to face her first true test on this base, and it would be brutal. Holloway advanced, his steps echoing in the quiet corridor. Maya's heart raced, but her mind remained razor-sharp. This wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message to him, to herself, and to anyone else who thought dominance came from intimidation alone. And then, in a single violent motion, it happened. Holloway shoved her forward, and her head collided with the cold, unforgiving porcelain of the restroom toilet. Pain exploded across her skull, and her vision blurred. The humiliation was immediate, sharp, and raw, but so was the surge of determination coursing through her veins. Maya's body shook, but her mind snapped into focus. Every officer on base would have expected tears, submission, or a fight she couldn't win. But she did none of that. Instead, she lifted her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his, the fire within her burning brighter than ever. The corridor fell silent, the echo of the impact hanging in the air like a warning. And in that heartbeat, both Maya and the base knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Because whatever came next, Maya was ready, and it would leave everyone at Fort Bragg stunned. The corridor was quiet now, but the silence was heavy with unspoken tension. Maya Thompson's hand pressed lightly to the back of her head, feeling the sharp sting where Colonel Holloway's fist had met her skull via the toilet. Pain radiated through her temples, but more than pain, it was the raw shock and humiliation that clenched her stomach. Her uniform, immaculate only moments ago, was rumpled from the shove. Her eyes scanned the narrow hallway, taking note of every shadow, every corner. Even though she was alone now, she could feel the gaze of the entire base on her, even if no one had witnessed the assault yet. Holloway leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking like a predator satisfied with its kill. His voice was low, calculated, dripping with condescension. "I hope you're learning, Lieutenant. This is not a playground. You're in my world now." Maya didn't flinch. She straightened, her back rigid, and took a careful step forward. Her voice was steady, even as the adrenaline surged. "I've been in worse, sir. I'm still standing." For a moment the colonel simply stared, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with disdain. He wasn't used to submission. He thrived on fear. And this, calm defiance, was unfamiliar terrain. He straightened and advanced. "Don't get cocky," he warned, closing the distance between them. "You'll learn quickly that rank means more than talent here." Maya knew better than to underestimate him. He was volatile, dangerous, and well-practiced in physical intimidation. She could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. And yet, amidst the pain, a plan was forming. Every officer she had trained with had taught her that when brute force was used against you, the smartest response wasn't always retaliation, it was strategy. The colonel's next move was sudden. In a blur of motion, he grabbed her by the arm and twisted it behind her back, pinning her against the cold metal wall. "Do you understand what it takes to survive here?" he hissed in her ear. The stench of his cologne and the sharpness of his command filled the small corridor. Maya's breath hitched, but she refused to panic. Instead, she focused. Her training had drilled into her the principle of controlled calm under extreme pressure. She slowly tilted her head, using her free hand to press against his chest, creating just enough leverage to relieve some of the pressure on her arm. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. "But survival doesn't come from intimidation alone." For the first time, Holloway's expression flickered. His eyes narrowed, analyzing her words, trying to decipher whether this was fear masked as defiance or something else entirely. Maya could feel the tension in the corridor like a living entity. Each second stretched, amplified by the pounding of her heart. She knew that one wrong move could escalate this further. And yet, she also knew that Holloway's strength lay in assumptions about fear, about submission, about obedience. If she could disrupt that perception, she could regain control, even in the midst of physical disadvantage. She took a subtle step back, easing the pressure he applied, all while keeping her tone calm and assertive. "Sir, I respect your authority, but this—" She gestured vaguely to the corridor, her bruised temple and the lingering tension between them "does not earn respect. It earns fear, and fear is fleeting. Respect lasts." Holloway froze, as if her words were a blade sliding against his armor. The other officers, though distant, would later describe the moment as a shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air, like a storm that has paused but hasn't yet broken. Then, in one swift motion, he shoved her forward. Maya stumbled, bracing herself against the wall, feeling the cold bite of the metal scrape along her skin. Pain flared again, sharper this time, but her mind snapped into hyperfocus. She knew what she had to do next. Maya reached into her jacket pocket with a controlled motion. Her hand closed around the small device she always carried, a hidden audio recorder, nearly invisible and untraceable. She had learned during previous deployments that the world was often unfair to those who couldn't document injustice. Today, that lesson was about to pay off. "Colonel Holloway," she said calmly, pressing a button on the device, "everything you just did is being recorded." The smirk that had dominated his face faltered, ever so slightly. The kind of falter that only comes when a predator realizes it might have underestimated its prey. Maya's voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that made him step back. "You don't," he started, but she cut him off. "Watch," she said simply, turning the device toward him. "Your actions, your words, every insult, every shove, every violation of protocol." The small red light blinked, subtle but undeniable. In an instant, Holloway's confident facade wavered. The colonel who had dominated entire wings of officers now faced a new reality, evidence that could not be ignored. Maya straightened fully, ignoring the pain and the throbbing ache at the back of her head. "I suggest you rethink your approach, sir," she said, her tone ice-cold but composed. "Because actions have consequences, even for those at the top." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Officers drawn by the commotion peeked from behind corners, whispering among themselves. None intervened yet, caught between fear and curiosity, but Maya could sense their attention shifting. The balance of power in the corridor had changed in a heartbeat. Holloway's eyes darted, calculating, trying to find a way to regain control. But the moment was gone. He had created a scene, but it had backfired spectacularly. For the first time, he wasn't dictating the narrative, Maya was. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her reaction to the pain. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't retaliate physically. Instead, she harnessed every ounce of control she had, letting the recording device speak louder than any argument, any act of violence. And then, just as she expected, Holloway did the unthinkable. He attempted one final intimidation, a glare, a step forward, a wordless threat meant to crush her composure. But Maya was ready. She raised her head, met his gaze, and smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet, terrifying calm of someone who had anticipated this moment. She pressed the recorder closer, ensuring every detail was captured. Holloway recoiled, almost imperceptibly but enough to make his posture falter. Maya's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through her, but her mind remained sharp. She had survived the assault and she had flipped the script. The corridor felt smaller now, the walls closing in not with intimidation, but with anticipation. Every officer present, whether they admitted it or not, was watching. They were witnessing something extraordinary, a young lieutenant standing unbroken against a colonel known for crushing spirits. Maya's lips barely moved as she spoke again, quieter this time but with unwavering authority. "This is not just about me, Colonel. This is about accountability, something you've forgotten in your pursuit of fear." Holloway's face, usually a mask of controlled arrogance, betrayed the first hint of uncertainty. He stepped back, then turned abruptly, muttering under his breath as he disappeared down the corridor, leaving the echo of his footsteps hanging like a threat. Maya exhaled slowly, her hand brushing the back of her head. The pain was still there, sharp and insistent, but overshadowed by a growing sense of power and clarity. She had survived, yes, but more importantly, she had asserted herself. She had sent a message that reverberated far beyond this corridor, far beyond this base. And as she walked back toward the briefing room, bruised but unbowed, Maya realized that this was only the beginning. Colonel Holloway had underestimated her, a mistake that would have consequences he had not anticipated. Because she was not just a soldier following orders. She was a force to be reckoned with. And everyone at Fort Bragg was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the briefing room was deafening compared to the pounding of Maya's heart. The recording device sat in her hand, small but powerful, a tool that had transformed the dynamic on the base in mere minutes. She glanced at the assembled officers, their eyes darting between her and the empty corridor where Colonel Holloway had retreated. The atmosphere was thick with tension, anticipation, and disbelief. Maya's pulse raced, but her exterior remained calm, composed, almost unnervingly so. She had trained for situations like this, but nothing could have prepared her for the audacity it would take to stand up to a man like Holloway and do it with strategic precision. Every officer in the room was watching, silently weighing her courage, her intelligence, and the audacity of her act. She pressed the record button on the small device again, ensuring everything was clear and audible. Then, in a controlled, deliberate voice, she began to speak. "This recording captures an incident that occurred earlier today," she said. "It documents actions that violate both military protocol and the fundamental respect due to any officer, regardless of rank. I present it not to challenge authority, but to uphold it, to ensure that discipline and accountability are preserved here at Fort Bragg." Whispers spread through the room. Some officers' jaws tightened, others leaned forward, curiosity and shock battling in their expressions. Holloway had a reputation for intimidation, and no one had ever publicly challenged him like this before. The sheer audacity of Maya's statement was enough to draw attention, but it was the device in her hand that held the power now. With a practiced hand, she pressed play. The soft, almost imperceptible click was followed by the unmistakable sound of Holloway's voice. The condescending tone, the sharp commands, the shove, the impact, all documented. The officers around her leaned in as the recording played, the words and sounds hitting with the weight of undeniable truth. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint static of the recording. Then, one by one, officers began to react. Some shook their heads in disbelief, unable to reconcile the man they had feared with the acts they were hearing. Others exchanged glances, whispers rising like a low tide of curiosity and concern. Holloway himself had not re-entered the room yet, but she knew he was listening, somewhere beyond the door, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Maya had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was growing, quietly but dangerously, in the minds of those who had once unquestioningly followed him. As the recording ended, Maya raised her eyes to the audience. Her gaze was firm, unwavering, and it carried a weight that demanded attention. "The purpose of this disclosure is not revenge," she continued. "It is accountability. Actions have consequences. Leadership is earned through respect, not fear, and every officer here deserves a culture of integrity, not intimidation." The effect was immediate. Officers who had avoided confrontation now nodded subtly, their eyes reflecting a new awareness. Some began to murmur affirmations, small gestures of solidarity that would ripple outward, challenging the unspoken hierarchy Holloway had built over years. Just as Maya finished speaking, the door creaked open. Every head turned, anticipation and fear mingling in the air. Colonel Holloway stepped in, his imposing figure framed by the doorway. For the first time, his usual confidence seemed fragile, his eyes scanning the room with a flicker of uncertainty. He moved toward the front, attempting to reclaim the narrative, but the energy in the room had shifted. Officers who once cowered now maintained eye contact, some subtly leaning in support of Maya, their presence a silent testament that power was no longer solely in Holloway's hands. "Lieutenant Thompson," Holloway said, his voice tight, controlled, though the smirk was gone, replaced by a tense stiffness. "What is the meaning of this?" Maya did not flinch. "Sir," she said, her tone firm but respectful, "it is the meaning of leadership. This is accountability. I trust you understand the severity of your actions." The tension in the room was palpable. Holloway's jaw tightened. He tried to argue, to deflect, to command obedience through the very intimidation that had always worked. But the room no longer responded to fear. Every officer present was witnessing a new paradigm, a junior officer standing unbroken, calling out misconduct, and doing so with undeniable evidence. For a few heartbeats, the room held its collective breath. Then quietly at first, whispers began to circulate. "Did he really do that? I've seen him berate others, but she's brave." The words spread like sparks across dry brush, igniting a sense of cautious hope and astonishment. Maya could feel the shift, the subtle trembling of control in Holloway's posture. He was calculating, trying to find a way to regain authority without further exposing himself. But the more he hesitated, the more the officers around him realized. His power was not absolute. It could be challenged. It could be dismantled. She stepped forward, ensuring that every eye in the room was on her. "Leadership is about accountability," she said again, emphasizing each word with quiet power. "Authority is not a shield for misconduct. It is a responsibility to uphold standards, to guide, and to protect. Today, sir, we are reminded that no one is above those standards." Holloway's hands twitched slightly at his sides, the slightest betray of his anger and frustration. He was used to controlling situations, manipulating perceptions, and silencing dissent. But here, in this room, he faced something he could not dominate: undeniable proof, courage under fire, and a base of officers who were quietly beginning to recognize the cracks in his authority. Maya knew this moment was critical. She had not only survived his assault but had transformed it into a strategic advantage. The recording was only the beginning. It had set the stage for a larger confrontation, one that would challenge the very foundation of Holloway's control. And then, just as she was about to conclude, a subtle sound caught her attention, the shuffle of boots in the hallway outside. Her instincts sharpened instantly. Someone was approaching, and the timing was deliberate, as if orchestrated. The door opened, and to the astonishment of everyone in the room, a senior officer from the command hierarchy entered, a man whose presence commanded respect without intimidation. His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on Holloway, then on Maya. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya's pulse quickened, but she did not flinch. She understood immediately. This was not just a witness. This was someone who could tip the balance, someone whose judgment could either protect her or expose her. Holloway shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shifting tides. His eyes darted between Maya and the senior officer, trying to reclaim dominance but finding the room no longer yielding to his presence. The officer's gaze was steady, assessing, and the tension in the air grew electric. Every officer present could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken question hanging in the balance. What would come next? Maya's lips pressed into a firm line, her mind racing through the possibilities, the contingencies. She had survived the physical attack. She had turned the tables strategically. But the true test was still ahead, one that would challenge not only her courage, but the very structure of authority on the base. And in that charged silence, the room seemed to hold its collective breath, knowing that the next few moments could change everything. Not just for Maya, not just for Holloway, but for every officer at Fort Bragg who had ever feared intimidation more than justice. Maya exhaled slowly, feeling the hum of adrenaline in her veins. This was the beginning of a reckoning, a calculated, deliberate, unstoppable retaliation that would leave the entire base stunned. Because one thing was certain, Colonel Holloway had underestimated her, and he would soon learn to his peril that she did not forgive mistakes, and she never forgot them. The corridors of Fort Bragg had never felt smaller nor heavier than they did now. Every officer seemed to walk a little taller, a little warier, glancing sideways as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension from the morning's events. Rumors traveled faster than orders here, and by midday, whispers about Maya Thompson and Colonel Holloway's confrontation had spread to every corner of the base. Some officers spoke in hushed tones, voices barely above a whisper. "Did you hear what happened?" A young private asked another as they passed in the hallway, their eyes darting to ensure they weren't overheard. She actually called him out, and recorded it. Others shook their heads in disbelief. "I've seen him humiliate officers before," a sergeant muttered to a group clustered near the mess hall. "But standing up to him like that, that's dangerous and bold." The rumor mill churned relentlessly, blending fact and speculation until no one could tell where reality ended and exaggeration began. But the essence of the story was clear. Maya had done what no one dared, and she had done it successfully. In her office, Maya sat quietly at her desk, rubbing the back of her head where the pain throbbed like a persistent drum. Every time she touched the bruise, it reminded her of the assault, the shock, and the humiliation. But more than pain, it reminded her of her strength. She had survived, and she had turned the assault into a tool of strategy. That was no small victory. Her thoughts were interrupted by a subtle knock at the door. Captain Daniel Ortiz stepped in, his expression tight but measured, eyes scanning the room as though expecting someone to leap from the shadows. Daniel was a veteran intelligence officer known for his ability to uncover truths hidden beneath layers of deception. He had heard the rumors and decided to investigate. "You handled that impressively," he said, his voice low. "But this is bigger than just one confrontation. Holloway doesn't just intimidate people for fun. There's a history here, patterns that go back years." Maya leaned back, the adrenaline from the morning beginning to settle. "I know," she admitted, "and I think it's time someone made those patterns visible, public, undeniable." Daniel nodded. "I agree, but we have to be careful. Holloway has loyalists, officers who will protect him, even if they know he's wrong. If we're not precise, he could turn the situation against us." Maya's eyes narrowed. "I didn't survive an assault to back down now." The tension in her office was palpable. Outside, the base moved with its usual rhythm, but the undercurrent of unease was unmistakable. Officers who had once avoided confrontation now seemed to watch Maya with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. Some offered small nods in passing, acknowledging her courage without words. Others avoided her gaze entirely, unsure how to navigate the new dynamic she had introduced. As the day progressed, Maya began receiving notes slipped under her office door, anonymous, cryptic messages that were at once warnings and encouragements. One read simply, They think you're done. They're wrong. Meet me at 500. Maya's pulse quickened. She knew the sender was likely someone with inside knowledge, someone willing to risk discovery to provide her guidance or assistance. The note carried both opportunity and danger. She tucked it into her pocket, careful not to reveal her reaction. Her instincts told her this meeting could be pivotal. Meanwhile, Holloway had retreated to his own office, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the walls. The humiliation of being publicly confronted was not something he had anticipated, nor the quiet, controlled power Maya had displayed. For the first time in years, he felt the cold edge of vulnerability. He sat in silence, plotting. He considered the paths of retaliation available to him: rumors, political maneuvering, questioning the authenticity of the recording. But he also knew, deep down, that her meticulous preparation and calm under pressure had created a problem he could not easily dismiss. The whispers in the corridors, the shifting loyalty of his officers, the subtle nods of respect toward Maya, all of it chipped away at the foundation of his authority. By late afternoon, Maya moved through the base again, observing the subtle changes in behavior. Officers who had once avoided eye contact now offered cautious acknowledgement. The young private who had whispered in the hallway earlier nodded slightly at her as she passed, a silent recognition of her courage. Even senior officers seemed to regard her differently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and cautious respect. She paused outside the mess hall, watching groups of officers gather. Some were quietly discussing the morning's events, their voices low but animated. The words recording and confrontation floated in fragments through the air, but Maya remained calm, observing. She knew that perception could be as powerful as truth, and controlling how others perceived the event was as critical as documenting it. The shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the base, lengthening corridors and darkening corners. Maya's mind was already moving ahead, anticipating Holloway's next steps. She understood that he would not act rashly, he never did. His retaliation would be calculated, strategic, and potentially destructive. She needed allies, and she needed evidence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she met with Daniel Ortiz in a quiet, unoccupied training room. The faint scent of gunpowder and sweat lingered in the air, a reminder of the base's constant cycle of drills and discipline. "We need to map everything," Daniel said, pulling a folder from his bag. "Every incident of intimidation, every officer who's been coerced, every report that's been buried. If we're going to challenge Holloway, we need more than one recording. We need a pattern, an undeniable trail." Maya nodded, her determination sharpening. "I've been collecting details quietly, notes, observations, enough to show the base, the command structure, and anyone else who might listen, that this isn't just one isolated incident." They worked late into the night, compiling, cross-referencing, and verifying. Every piece of evidence was a potential weapon, every witness a potential shield. The quiet clatter of keyboards and the scratch of pens filled the room, punctuated by occasional murmurs of analysis. As they wrapped up, Maya's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, an anonymous text: "Tomorrow morning, don't be late. The truth needs witnesses." Her pulse quickened. Whoever was guiding her had chosen the moment carefully. The stakes were rising. Every officer she had previously seen whispering in corridors, every skeptical glance now carried the weight of anticipation. Holloway's miscalculation had set off a chain reaction that was gaining momentum, and Maya was at its center. She left the training room quietly, moving through the dimly lit corridors with practiced awareness. Each shadow could hide a threat, each step could be observed, and yet she walked unafraid. The base was changing, and she was both the catalyst and the observer. As she reached her quarters, she paused at the doorway, glancing back toward the main corridors. The silence of the evening was deceptive. The base was holding its breath, waiting, watching. And somewhere, Holloway was plotting. She could feel it in the air, in the subtle vibrations of unease that traveled through walls and floors. Maya exhaled slowly. The assault had left physical pain, but it had also sparked something far more potent: awareness, strategy, and the potential to reshape the hierarchy of Fort Bragg. She knew that the confrontation was only the beginning. What she had started could not be undone, not by fear, not by intimidation, not by the colonel himself. And in the quiet of her room, as the base settled into the night, Maya allowed herself a small, private thought. This was not just about surviving. This was about transforming the system, and she was ready to see it through, no matter what it cost. Because in the shadows, plans were being made, alliances formed, and every officer who had once bowed to fear was beginning to understand that the world had shifted, and that Lieutenant Maya Thompson was no longer a subordinate to be intimidated. The storm had begun, and everyone at Fort Bragg would feel its impact. The pre-dawn darkness of Fort Bragg was oppressive, the stillness broken only by the faint hum of distant generators and the occasional clatter of boots on asphalt. Maya Thompson stood at the edge of the training grounds, her uniform neat despite the bruises darkening her temples and the soreness still radiating through her body. The chill of the morning did little to dampen the fire inside her. She had survived Holloway's assault, turned it into undeniable evidence, and now she was about to take the next step, one that could either expose the colonel fully or put her in far greater danger. A shadow emerged from the corner of the grounds, moving swiftly but deliberately. Captain Daniel Ortiz appeared, his presence as discreet as ever, his expression tight with purpose. Maya greeted him with a silent nod. Words weren't necessary yet. Both understood the stakes. The whispered promises of support had led to this clandestine meeting, far from prying eyes, far from surveillance cameras, far from Holloway's reach. "Lieutenant," Daniel began, keeping his voice low, "what you did yesterday was unprecedented. But this isn't just about courage. This is about strategy, and if we're going to expose Holloway, we need to be precise, methodical, and patient." Maya nodded, her jaw set. "I'm ready, tell me what you know." Daniel handed her a small folder, thick with carefully organized documents, notes, and witness statements. "This is everything I've been able to gather," he said. "Reports of intimidation, threats, unreported incidents, and disciplinary actions buried in the archives. Holloway has a network, officers loyal to him who cover up his abuses. But if we connect the dots, we can show a pattern that's undeniable." Maya's eyes scanned the folder quickly, absorbing the names, dates, and incidents. She had heard rumors before of officers too afraid to speak out, of young lieutenants who had quietly left the base after confrontations with Holloway, but seeing it all documented in black and white, with corroborating evidence, made her stomach tight. This was bigger than she had imagined. Daniel continued, his tone urgent. "We also have to consider his tactics. He's cunning, manipulative, and he's already begun testing boundaries since yesterday. If we make one wrong move, he'll spin this into an attack against you. You need witnesses, support, and more evidence than even this." Maya closed the folder and met his gaze. "Then we do it. Every detail, every officer willing to speak, every document, we expose it all." They began their work immediately, walking through the base under the cover of darkness, meeting quietly with officers who had already shown subtle signs of allegiance. Some were hesitant, eyes flicking to shadows as if expecting Holloway to appear from nowhere. Others were more bold, stepping forward with accounts of intimidation and harassment that they had kept secret for years. Each story was a thread, and Maya knew that if woven together carefully, it would reveal the full fabric of the colonel's abuse. At first, the officers were cautious, whispering in corners and shadowed rooms, sharing only what they believed they could safely disclose. Maya listened, taking notes mentally as much as physically, learning not just the facts but the emotional toll Holloway's reign had taken. She saw fear etched into faces, hesitation in movements, and relief in speaking truth to someone willing to hear it. By mid-morning, she and Daniel had a small but growing network of allies. There was Sergeant Lucas Mayers, a man whose quiet loyalty had been tested repeatedly. Lieutenant Corinne Fields, who had once been humiliated by Holloway in front of her peers, and a handful of junior officers who, until now, had never dared to speak. Together, they were beginning to form a coalition. Maya understood that alliances alone weren't enough. Holloway's influence was vast and his manipulation subtle. One false step could unravel everything. She began to strategize, planning how to gather tangible, indisputable evidence. Emails, internal reports, audio recordings, eyewitness accounts, anything that could corroborate her initial recording and make the case airtight. By noon, Maya and Daniel had mapped out a plan. They would work in teams to quietly access archived reports, cross-reference incidents, and identify patterns of intimidation, retaliation, and abuse. Each step was carefully calculated to avoid detection. Holloway had spies among the staff, officers whose loyalty outweighed ethics, and Maya knew that trust would be fragile. Every interaction, every note, every whispered conversation could be a test of courage and discretion. As they worked, Maya couldn't ignore the constant tension in the air. She had felt it yesterday when the assault had left her reeling, and she felt it now, like a silent drumbeat under her skin. Holloway was aware that she was organizing, that she was forming alliances, and she could feel the subtle vibrations of his plotting even without direct confrontation. Late in the afternoon, a new development added urgency. One of the junior officers approached Maya discreetly, glancing nervously down the hallway before speaking. "Lieutenant Thompson, the colonel has noticed changes. He's asking questions. People are talking, be careful." Maya's lips pressed together. She understood the warning. Holloway would not react impulsively, he was too calculating. But he would react strategically, targeting weaknesses, testing loyalty, and probing for cracks in their coalition. Every officer they recruited, every piece of evidence they gathered, now carried risk. "We expected this," Maya said quietly, her tone calm but resolute. "We anticipated his scrutiny. We'll proceed carefully. Every move has to be deliberate. We cannot afford mistakes." That evening, Maya returned to her quarters to review the compiled evidence with Daniel. The folder had grown heavier, filled with notes, testimonies, and internal documents that exposed Holloway's patterns of abuse. She felt a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. The stakes had never been higher. The consequences of failure were severe, but the consequences of success promised justice for countless officers who had suffered in silence. As she laid out the evidence, Daniel spoke cautiously. "We're close, but we're not done. This isn't just about proving what happened yesterday. This is about creating an unbreakable chain of accountability. If we do it right, no one can dismiss it, not the colonel, not his allies, not anyone." Maya nodded, her resolve firm. "Then we continue. Every officer willing to speak, every document, every witness, we compile it all. And when the time comes, we present it together, united, indisputable." The night deepened and the base settled into an uneasy quiet. Maya lay awake on her cot, replaying the events of the past 24 hours. The assault, the humiliation, the courage she had summoned, the gathering alliances, all of it was a delicate web, balanced between exposure and danger. She understood that Holloway's retaliation could come at any moment, unpredictable and devastating. But she also understood something else. She had turned the tables. She had survived the first attack, and now she was building a force capable of challenging the colonel's entire regime. As sleep eluded her, a message flickered on her phone, anonymous, yet unmistakable. "Tomorrow morning we move, be ready. Witnesses will see everything." Maya exhaled slowly, a mixture of anticipation and determination coursing through her veins. She had survived, she had retaliated, and now she was about to escalate. The colonel's empire of fear was vulnerable, and she intended to dismantle it methodically, strategically, and decisively. Somewhere in the shadows of Fort Bragg, Colonel Holloway was aware that the storm had begun. And Maya Thompson, bruised but unbroken, was ready to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Because this wasn't just about one confrontation anymore. This was about justice, accountability, and sending a message that no one, not even a colonel, could hide behind intimidation. And for Maya, there was no turning back. The alliance had been formed, the evidence was mounting, and the reckoning was coming. The morning air at Fort Bragg was sharp, carrying the faint scent of dew and gasoline from the parked military vehicles. Maya Thompson's boots clicked steadily against the asphalt as she walked toward the central command hall, the folder of compiled evidence secure under her arm. Every officer she passed offered subtle, almost imperceptible nods of acknowledgement. No words, but the silent support was unmistakable. The base had shifted in the past few days. The energy, once oppressive under Holloway's dominance, now hummed with quiet anticipation. Inside the command hall, the room was already filling with officers of every rank. Whispers rippled through the assembled crowd, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and anticipation. Holloway had arrived early, standing at the front, his arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes scanning the room with the meticulous calculation of a man accustomed to control. But even he could not fully mask the tension. The atmosphere was charged, electric, every eye secretly assessing the balance of power. Maya entered and moved confidently toward the front of the room, her posture straight, her expression calm yet unwavering. She carried herself like someone who had been through fire and emerged unbroken, which, in truth, she had. The recording device from the previous confrontation, along with the thick folder of evidence, rested in her hands. Each step she took echoed deliberate, commanding attention. The room fell into a hush as she stopped before the colonel. Holloway's eyes flicked briefly to the folder, then to her face, and for the first time there was a flash of unease, subtle but noticeable. Maya seized the moment. "Good morning, sir," she began, her voice steady, carrying across the silent hall. "Today, I present evidence of actions that violate military protocol, breach ethical conduct, and undermine the integrity of our command structure. This is not personal. This is about accountability." She placed the folder on the table in front of her and set the recording device beside it. A small red light blinked, capturing every moment. Every eye in the room was on her. Officers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in disbelief, others exchanging subtle glances, realizing that the story they had heard in whispers was about to be publicly confirmed. Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. He tried to speak, to assert authority, but Maya raised a hand gently, halting him without confrontation. "Please," she said calmly, "let the evidence speak first." With deliberate precision, she pressed play. The room filled with the unmistakable sounds of Holloway's earlier assault, the shove, the condescending commands, the impact of her head hitting the toilet. The officers flinched collectively, some instinctively looking away, others whispering under their breath. The tension was palpable. As the recording ended, Maya began to methodically present the folder's contents. Each document, report, and note told a story of intimidation, manipulation, and misconduct. She highlighted patterns, incidents repeated over months, officers silenced or reassigned, complaints buried in bureaucratic red tape. She spoke with clarity, precision, and authority, her calm demeanor reinforcing the credibility of every word. Holloway's hands twitched at his sides. He tried to interrupt, to assert his version of events, but the room no longer reacted to fear. Officers who once cowered under his gaze now watched silently, their expressions betraying a growing awareness that the balance of power had shifted. "Colonel Holloway," Maya said finally, her voice firm, measured, yet piercing, "these are the facts. These are not allegations to be whispered in corners. These are documented incidents, corroborated by multiple witnesses and official records. The question now is not whether these events occurred, but how we, as a command structure, respond to them." A murmur ran through the room. Some officers nodded subtly, others exchanged glances of shock or disbelief. The colonel's loyalists remained stoic, but even they could feel the cracks appearing in the edifice of unquestioned authority. Holloway's voice finally emerged, low and controlled, though the tension in it betrayed his composure. "Lieutenant Thompson," he said, "you are overstepping your bounds. You have presented one side of a story, and yet you presume judgment over me and my command." Maya met his gaze evenly, unflinching. "Sir, I am presenting documented facts. This is not judgment. This is accountability. Leadership is earned through integrity, not intimidation. And those who follow orders must trust that their leaders will act ethically, not through fear." The room remained silent, hanging on her every word. Maya continued, now introducing statements from officers who had chosen to step forward, providing testimony of intimidation, harassment, and abuse. Some spoke anonymously through Daniel Ortiz, their voices read aloud. Others had agreed to attend personally, standing quietly in the back, observing witnesses to the unfolding confrontation. Each statement added weight, each piece of evidence reinforced the narrative. Holloway shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking nervously around the room. He had built an empire of control through fear, but now that empire was being dismantled methodically, piece by piece, in front of every officer on the base. Maya paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle over the room. She looked around, locking eyes with as many officers as she could, silently communicating what was unspoken. Courage, integrity, and accountability could not be silenced. Then she delivered the final blow, the one that would solidify the undeniable reality of Holloway's misconduct. "This is not about one incident," she said, gesturing to the compiled folder. "This is a pattern, a system of intimidation, manipulation, and abuse, and today it ends. Leadership is not a shield for misconduct, Colonel. It is a responsibility to uphold ethics, fairness, and justice." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Even Holloway's closest allies could no longer maintain the illusion that his authority was unassailable. The room's atmosphere had shifted completely, a combination of shock, awe, and dawning recognition that the colonel's reign of intimidation had been exposed. For the first time, Holloway faltered, his carefully maintained composure cracking. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that words alone could no longer regain control. The evidence, the witnesses, and the alliance Maya had quietly cultivated had combined into a force he could not counter. Maya stepped back slightly, letting the silence speak. The tension was almost unbearable, a tangible presence that filled the room. Officers whispered quietly to one another, the murmurs carrying a mixture of disbelief and relief. Some reached for their phones to record, others simply nodded in acknowledgement. The entire base seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the next move. And then, without warning, a senior officer from the higher command stepped forward. His presence was commanding, immediate, and undeniable. He had reviewed Maya's evidence in secret and had arrived to witness the confrontation firsthand. Every eye in the room turned toward him, including Holloway's. "Colonel Holloway," the senior officer said, his tone cold, measured, and absolute, "you have been presented with irrefutable evidence of misconduct. These actions violate the principles of our command and the trust of your officers. You will answer for these actions before this command." Holloway's face paled, his shoulders sagging slightly for the first time. The man who had once instilled fear through every gesture, every command, now stood exposed, powerless in the face of truth. Maya's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through her, but she remained composed. She had planned for this moment, anticipated every reaction, and executed with precision. The senior officer's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Maya. There was a subtle acknowledgement, a silent recognition of her courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination. The weight of authority had shifted, and the base knew it. Holloway finally turned, storming from the room in a flurry of frustration, muttering under his breath. The impact of the confrontation rippled through the officers left behind, a mixture of awe, relief, and renewed hope. The storm Maya had begun was now fully underway, and its effects would be felt across the base for months to come. Maya exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of triumph and cautious anticipation. This was not the end. Holloway would not vanish quietly, and the repercussions of his exposure would unfold over time. But she had survived, she had retaliated, and she had catalyzed a transformation in the very structure of Fort Bragg. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, officers sharing relief, disbelief, and quiet admiration. Maya stood at the front, her eyes scanning the faces before her, silently absorbing the enormity of what had just transpired. She had not only confronted a colonel, she had changed the rules of engagement, set a precedent, and ensured that accountability had finally been restored. As the officers began to leave, murmuring among themselves, Maya turned to Daniel Ortiz, who had watched the proceedings unfold with pride and quiet admiration. "It's only the beginning," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Daniel nodded. "Yes, but it's a damn good beginning." Maya's gaze swept the room one last time, eyes locking on Holloway's retreating figure outside the doorway. The colonel's empire of fear was crumbling, and she had been the catalyst. The storm had arrived, and no one, not even Colonel Holloway, would ever forget the name Maya Thompson. The halls of Fort Bragg had never been quieter yet more charged with tension. In the days following the public confrontation, whispers, rumors, and cautious conversations filled every corner of the base. Officers moved with new awareness. Loyalty was being reassessed, allegiances subtly realigned, and the shadow of Colonel Holloway's intimidation had begun to lift. Yet the air remained thick with uncertainty, as everyone waited to see how far the repercussions would reach. Maya Thompson walked through the corridors with measured steps, aware of the dozens of eyes discreetly following her. Some looked at her with admiration, others with disbelief, and a few with lingering skepticism. She had changed the dynamic at Fort Bragg, but she knew the fight for accountability was far from over. Holloway's allies would resist quietly, and the colonel himself would not vanish without a plan. Captain Daniel Ortiz fell into step beside her. "You've sparked a lot more than we anticipated," he said quietly, careful not to draw attention. "Officers who have been silent for years are starting to talk. The energy on this base has shifted, and it's only going to accelerate." Maya nodded, her expression calm but focused. "Good. We need the momentum to continue. Change doesn't happen with one confrontation. It happens with persistence, visibility, and unwavering commitment to truth." Their first stop was the senior officer who had witnessed the confrontation. In a secure office, the officer, Brigadier General Alan Cross, began reviewing the compiled evidence Maya and Daniel had meticulously gathered. Emails, reports, audio recordings, and testimonies formed a chain of accountability that left little room for dismissal. "This is comprehensive," General Cross said, his voice steady but tinged with astonishment. "You've done something extraordinary, Lieutenant Thompson. Holloway has cultivated fear for years, but you've provided irrefutable proof that he's misused his authority. His ability to intimidate is now powerless against documented evidence and witness statements." Maya's jaw tightened, not from pride but from the awareness of the responsibility she now carried. "Sir, this isn't about me. It's about the base, the officers who have suffered in silence, and ensuring that leadership is accountable. I'm just the one who had to start the process." The general nodded solemnly. "And you've done it well. This will trigger an internal investigation. Holloway will be placed on administrative leave immediately. We need to ensure the process is thorough, fair, and public to restore confidence in the command." Maya exhaled slowly. The formal repercussions were beginning. Holloway's empire of fear was collapsing, but she understood the real challenge lay ahead, managing the aftermath and ensuring the base healed. Fear, resentment, and uncertainty didn't vanish overnight. Officers would need guidance, reassurance, and leadership to navigate the transition. By the afternoon, news of Holloway's administrative leave spread quietly but inevitably throughout the base. Officers who had once whispered in corners now met in small groups, discussing the events of the past week, the confrontation, and the upcoming investigation. Some expressed relief, others awe, and a few were still cautious, uncertain how to act in the new environment. Maya and Daniel moved among these groups, offering quiet support, encouragement, and guidance. They listened to officers' stories, acknowledged fears, and helped channel energy into constructive action. It was not a time for celebration. The wounds of years of intimidation were deep, and many officers were still grappling with the psychological toll Holloway had inflicted. In one corner of the base, Lieutenant Corinne Fields, one of Maya's allies, approached her cautiously. "Lieutenant Thompson, thank you," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "For standing up, for giving us the courage to speak. I don't know if anyone else could have done what you did." Maya shook her head gently. "This was never about one person. This was about all of you, about creating an environment where accountability matters more than fear. You all played a role, you just needed someone to start the process." Elsewhere, Sergeant Lucas Mayers and several other officers worked with Daniel to secure additional evidence, corroborating reports and statements that would strengthen the investigation. The process was meticulous, requiring discretion, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. Every document, every testimony, every timeline had to be precise, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Meanwhile, Holloway remained in his office seething. His network of loyalists had been disrupted, and the tide of influence he once commanded was slipping through his fingers. He tried to intimidate a few officers privately, but the chain of accountability was too strong, the witnesses too numerous, and the evidence too overwhelming. For the first time in his career, the colonel felt powerless. The investigation, officially launched under the oversight of Brigadier General Cross, began in earnest. Officers who had once feared retaliation now stepped forward willingly, providing detailed accounts of intimidation, harassment, and misconduct. The systematic abuse that had been hidden for years was laid bare, one account at a time. Maya and her allies served as guides and witnesses, ensuring the process remained transparent and thorough. As days turned into a week, the atmosphere on the base continued to shift. Officers walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and began to reclaim spaces that had once been dominated by fear. Rumors of the colonel's past abuses were confirmed, and his credibility eroded further. The ripple effects of Maya's courage and strategic planning were transforming the culture of Fort Bragg. Yet Maya remained vigilant. She knew Holloway would not vanish quietly, and some officers still clung to loyalty out of fear or self-preservation. The process required careful navigation to prevent backlash or covert sabotage. Every interaction, every meeting, every step forward was calculated, ensuring that accountability remained intact while morale and trust were rebuilt. One evening, as Maya reviewed the latest statements and reports, a junior officer approached her cautiously. "Lieutenant Thompson, people are noticing. They're talking about what you've done, how you've changed things. Some are scared of retaliation, but most, they're inspired." Maya's lips pressed into a tight line. "Inspiration is only the first step," she said softly. "Change requires action, persistence, and accountability. The goal isn't recognition. It's ensuring that no officer ever feels the way we've all seen officers feel under fear and intimidation." The officer nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "We'll follow your lead," they said quietly. "We just want to see justice done and the base restored." Maya exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and determination coursing through her. The storm she had unleashed was no longer contained. The chain reaction of accountability, courage, and truth had begun, spreading through every corner of the base. Holloway's empire of fear had crumbled, but the work of rebuilding trust, ensuring justice, and reinforcing ethical leadership had only just begun. As night fell, Maya looked out over the base from her quarters, the lights twinkling faintly in the darkness. She thought of the officers who had come forward, the ones still hesitant, and the long road ahead. But for the first time, she allowed herself a small sense of satisfaction. The power of fear had been challenged, and the command structure had begun to reflect integrity rather than intimidation. Somewhere in the shadows, Holloway was plotting his next move, but the foundations of his control were gone. The investigation would continue. The evidence was overwhelming, and the culture of Fort Bragg was irrevocably changing. Maya had survived, retaliated, and catalyzed a transformation that no one could ignore. The storm had passed, but the aftermath, the rebuilding, the reckoning, and the restoration had begun. And Maya Thompson, bruised, determined, and unbroken, stood at the center, ready to ensure that justice would prevail, no matter the cost. The sun rose over Fort Bragg, its light spilling across the parade grounds, casting long shadows over the buildings and officers assembling for morning roll call. The base, once tense with fear and whispered rumors, now hummed with a mixture of anticipation, curiosity, and cautious optimism. Today was the day the investigation into Colonel Holloway's conduct would officially conclude, and the consequences of years of intimidation would finally be made visible. Maya Thompson stood near the command center, her uniform impeccable, her posture unwavering. The bruises and soreness from previous encounters had faded, replaced by the quiet strength of someone who had endured both physical and emotional trials and emerged victorious. Around her, officers glanced her way, subtle nods acknowledging the courage that had altered the course of the base's history. She didn't seek attention, she had sought justice, and recognition was irrelevant. Yet it was impossible to ignore the ripple of respect that followed her movements. Captain Daniel Ortiz joined her, carrying a tablet with the finalized investigation report. "It's all here," he said quietly. "Every incident documented, every witness accounted for. The findings leave no room for doubt. Holloway's actions, spanning years, have been verified and substantiated. Administrative action will be decisive." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anticipation but in resolve. Then it's time. The base needs closure. The officers need to see that accountability matters, that fear has consequences. Inside the command hall, officers gathered in rows, whispers ceasing as the Brigadier General Alan Cross stepped to the front. His expression was stern, the authority in his posture absolute. Every officer's attention was drawn immediately. The room felt electrically charged, as though everyone present sensed the culmination of the storm that had begun weeks before. "Officers of Fort Bragg," General Cross began, his voice resonant, "we are gathered today to acknowledge a series of serious breaches in leadership, conduct, and ethical responsibility. Over the past weeks, a thorough investigation has been conducted regarding allegations of misconduct by Colonel Holloway. The findings are clear, indisputable, and demand immediate action." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Every head turned slightly, some exchanging glances, others stiffening with anticipation. Maya stood quietly at the front, beside Daniel Ortiz, the evidence they had gathered now fully corroborated and presented. "Colonel Holloway," General Cross continued, "your conduct has been found to violate the principles of military leadership, ethical standards, and the trust placed in you by both your officers and the command structure. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties, pending further disciplinary review. This action is necessary to preserve the integrity of the base and to restore confidence in the chain of command." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Holloway, seated at the front, visibly paled. His usual composure faltered, and for the first time in years, the armor of intimidation that had protected him was gone. He attempted to rise to protest, but General Cross's gaze pinned him in place. The silence that followed was deafening, a mix of relief, shock, and awe echoing through the assembly. Maya stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "This is not merely about one individual," she said, addressing the room of officers. "It is about accountability, integrity, and the responsibility we carry as leaders. Fear cannot be a tool of authority. Respect must be earned through action, not intimidation. Today, the base witnesses that truth, courage, and ethics prevail. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Officers who had once been silenced now whispered quietly to one another, some nodding in silent agreement, others visibly moved. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The culture of fear that had permeated Fort Bragg for years was breaking apart, replaced by a renewed sense of justice and possibility. Holloway finally stood, his face tight with anger and disbelief. He tried to speak, to defend his actions, to manipulate perception, but the room no longer yielded to fear. Witnesses and allies were present, documentation undeniable, and every officer in the hall now aware that intimidation no longer held sway. His words fell flat, lost amidst the quiet acknowledgement of truth. Maya maintained eye contact with the colonel, her expression unwavering. She didn't need to say more. Her presence, her courage, and the evidence spoke louder than any argument could. Holloway's power, once absolute, had been dismantled piece by piece, and he understood in that moment that he had no ground left to stand on. The brigadier general signaled quietly, and military police moved to escort Holloway from the hall. Every officer present watched, some with subtle satisfaction, others with shock at the abrupt removal of a figure they had feared for years. The sound of Holloway's footsteps receding down the hallway was a symbolic punctuation to the chapter of intimidation and abuse that had plagued Fort Bragg. Maya exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph. The battle had been hard-fought, not with weapons or brute force, but with courage, strategy, and unwavering dedication to truth. She had faced assault, threats, and skepticism, yet she had prevailed. Outside the hall, officers began to gather in small groups, discussing the events, sharing their own experiences, and acknowledging the shift in culture. Lieutenant Karen Fields approached Maya, eyes bright with emotion. "Lieutenant Thompson," she said softly, "what you did, it's more than courage. You've changed everything for us, for the base, for everyone who was too afraid to speak." Maya shook her head, a modest smile forming. "It's not just me, it's all of us. Every officer who came forward, every ally who stood quietly, every piece of evidence collected, we did this together. Fear was challenged and integrity won." Captain Daniel Ortiz joined them, placing a supportive hand on Maya's shoulder. "You've set a precedent, Maya, one that will be remembered long after this moment. Fort Bragg will never forget that accountability matters, and that courage can inspire change." The day continued with formal acknowledgments, administrative actions, and supportive meetings with officers who had been affected by Holloway's behavior. Maya and Daniel worked tirelessly, ensuring that the transition remained orderly and that the base's morale was restored. By evening, Maya found a quiet moment alone, standing on the balcony overlooking the training grounds. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The base, once a place of fear and tension, now carried the subtle hum of renewed confidence. Officers moved with purpose, conversations were open, and a culture of accountability was beginning to take root. She allowed herself a small, private smile. The physical bruises had healed, but the lessons, the strength, and the resolve remained. Maya knew that the work of leadership was ongoing, that change required persistence, vigilance, and courage every single day. But she also knew that she had made a profound difference, not just for herself, but for every officer at Fort Bragg. In her mind, she replayed the moments that had led to this victory: the assault, the recording, the alliances, the strategic planning, and the final confrontation. Each challenge had tested her, yet each had also revealed her resilience and capacity to lead under unimaginable pressure. And somewhere, in the distant shadows of the base, Holloway's influence had been extinguished, replaced by a culture that valued integrity, courage, and accountability above fear. Maya exhaled deeply, letting the weight of the day settle over her. She had faced the impossible, turned it into opportunity, and emerged not just victorious, but transformative. Fort Bragg had witnessed the power of truth and the impact of courage, and the legacy of that day would endure long after the echoes of confrontation faded. For Maya Thompson, it was more than justice. It was proof that one person, armed with strategy, courage, and unwavering integrity, could change an entire system. And as the stars began to emerge over the base, she allowed herself a final thought. The storm had passed, the reckoning had been delivered, and Fort Bragg would never again forget the name of the officer who dared to stand unbroken against fear, Lieutenant Maya Thompson. The base exhaled, history had been made, and a new chapter had begun.